Good morning. Before we hear from the next witness, I wish to say something about the schedule of the inquiry today. This afternoon, the inquiry was scheduled to hear the playback of the further examination of Alan Payton by senior counsel to the inquiry in an examination I appointed in order to deal with the oral applications under Rule 9 of the inquiry's rules. Yesterday, the legal representative of Mr. Payton made representations in relation to the conditions in which the tape should be played. In order properly to consider these, and bearing in mind the importance of this witness to the inquiry, I would require a written application together with supporting evidence. In these circumstances, I have continued the playback of the examination until a later date in order that I may consider any such application. I acknowledge that the late change may cause inconvenience to members of the public who wanted to watch the evidence, but sometimes changes do have to be made at short notice. Could we have the witness, please? Yes, certainly. Mr. Ryder, I'm sorry you've been kept waiting. I wonder if you would raise your hand and say the words of the oath after me. I swear by Almighty God
I swear by Almighty God
that I will tell the truth,
that I will tell the truth,
the whole truth,
and
nothing but the truth.
and nothing but the truth.
Miss Graham.
Thank you. Good morning. You're Paul Ryder.
That's correct, yes.
Thank you. And what age are you, Mr. Ryder?
I'm 54.
You're a reporting scientist with Cellmark Forensic Services.
I am, yes.
And you are based in their premises in Chorley in England.
That's correct, yes.
Thank you. I was watching a documentary recently on the TV, and it showed Cellmark's premises, and it said they'd been involved in the World's End murders, looking at DNA and at the forefront of forensic science and improvements. Is that the place that you work?
It is, yes.
And tell us a little bit about Cellmark, please.
Cellmark is a privately owned company that started off as a specialist DNA company and has expanded into doing a whole range of forensic science, and is contracted to a number of police forces across the United Kingdom and around the world to carry out forensic work on their behalf.
And it's not just police forces that you work for or do work for, it's the Crown Prosecution Service?
Well, we serve the criminal justice system, so we will then do work on behalf of the Crown Prosecution Service. We can be asked to undertake independent reviews on behalf of the defence in criminal trials, and undertake work sometimes in civil cases as well.
So it's the whole justice system, really?
Yes.
Thank you. Before I go take you through your evidence today, you will see that there is a blue folder in front of you.
Yes.
And if you please feel free to open that up. And what should be in it is a letter of instruction that you were sent, an appendix of documents you were sent, and a report that you prepared on behalf of the inquiry.
Yes.
So as we go through things today, you'll see on the computer screen in front of you that we maybe put things onto the screen so that they can be viewed around the room and more widely and by the public. But in addition, you'll always have your hard copies there. So if you need to look at anything, if you want another paragraph shown, please just let me know and we can have that brought up on the screen.
Okay.
Good. Can we talk first about your own CV?
Okay.
And a good place to start might be your report, which is SBPI 00171. And if we can bring that up on the screen, and you'll see the front page, Cellmark Forensic Services, Tread Analysis Report, Sheku Bio Inquiry, and then that's your name and reporting scientist, Cellmark, and it's dated the 6th of October this year.
Yes.
And if we could turn to page 3, please, we should see your qualifications and experience. Now, I won't go through this line by line. The chair will have that available to him to consider at his leisure. But am I right in saying you've got a first-class honours degree in chemistry?
I have, yes.
And you're a chartered chemist?
Yes.
What does that mean?
I'm a member of the professional body, the Royal Society of Chemistry, and as a result of that, I've got professional qualification as a chartered chemist.
Right. So is that an additional qualification that you've achieved?
Yes, it's in recognition of ongoing professional work in the field of chemistry.
Thank you. And you've been employed as a forensic scientist for over 33 years?
That's correct, yes.
Initially by the Forensic Science Service and laterally by Cellmark since August of 2008.
That's right, yes.
And although you're here today as a skilled witness, as an expert witness on our behalf, you're still practicing as a forensic scientist.
I am, yes.
So you're doing the analysis and the work as well as being an expert.
Yes.
And it says here on page 3, you also hold the role of Forensic Science Manager at the Chorley Lab of Cellmark Forensic Science.
That's correct, yes.
What does that involve?
It's an overseeing role in terms of the quality of the science that we undertake, balanced against operational needs. So it's looking after the quality of the work that's done, making sure that we comply with the relevant accreditation and regulations, and making sure that all the staff are appropriately trained and competent to undertake their work and maintain that competence.
And do you have a responsibility to check the work of more junior members of staff and make sure they're doing things to a suitable standard?
Well, all our work that we undertake is peer reviewed, so my work would be peer reviewed by a second individual, so it's not necessarily someone that's more junior, it's someone that carries out the same type of work that you do, and you carry out an independent review of that work before any reports are issued.
And for members of the public that may be listening to you that aren't familiar with the term peer review, can you explain a little bit more what that is?
Effectively, your work is checked by another expert in your area of expertise, and all your findings will be critically checked. Your statement will be reviewed, not just for spelling errors and the likes, but to make sure that interpretation is correct and all the details are correct before the statement's issued.
And does that provide a level of reassurance that the work has been done properly and accurately?
Yes.
Thank you. We heard some evidence on Tuesday from a Professor Lorna Dawson. Are you familiar with Professor Dawson?
I met her when we were undertaking these examinations, yes.
She said that in Chorley they have a number of sterile labs and different labs to carry out work to ensure that there's no cross-contamination. Is that correct?
That's correct, yes. We do a lot of trace evidence work, and depending on the nature of the work, we have different anti-contamination procedures. So we'll have gunshot residue clean laboratories, we have DNA clean laboratories, and then we have protocols in all the other laboratories to prevent contamination occurring.
So are there a lot of safeguards in place to make sure that everything is sterile and there's no cross-contamination from one item to another?
That's correct, yes.
And those safeguards were in place when you did the work for the inquiry?
Yes.
Thank you. And your CV also mentions that you are responsible for defining and maintaining in the lab standard operating procedures for Cellmark and overseeing the validation of those methods, resulting in their accreditation by the forensic regulator.
That's correct, yes.
What does that mean?
The forensics regulator has a code of conduct and practice and conduct, which all forensic science providers in England and Wales are expected to adhere to, which requires us to have UCAS accreditation. So as part of that, any methods that we use have to be suitably validated and the evidence provided so it can be independently reviewed by UCAS. And as part of that, we have training plans, we have training and competency monitoring systems, we have standard operating procedures, all of which are reviewed regularly to keep them up to date and to make sure that there is a process of continuous improvement.
And so everything's checked and double-checked, really?
Yes.
And then it also says, as well as undertaking work for law enforcement agencies, I've also been instructed as an expert in a number of civil cases and undertaken defence reviews of forensic evidence. Can you tell us a little bit more about your work as an expert witness?
It involves, on some occasions, going out to scenes, helping to gather evidence at scenes before it's actually submitted to the lab. It involves managing the examinations, making sure that all the essential evidence is captured and that there is no possible contamination of that as part of the processes, because some of the examinations we might undertake might impact on other people's work and the recovery of their evidence. So a strategy is evolved. The examinations are done, the findings are then interpreted, then they're critically checked, and then a report is issued. And then ultimately, if required, we attend court to give evidence as an impartial expert witness to the court.
And you've given evidence before court or inquiry proceedings before, haven't you?
Many times, yes.
And am I right in saying the other thing that you mention in your CV is that recently you've given evidence in the investigation of the Manchester Arena bombing?
I did, yes.
And you had to present evidence at the inquiry, and you've also presented evidence at the criminal trial.
I did, yes.
Thank you. And you mentioned the word impartial. And is it correct to say that as an expert witness, you understand your obligations are to the chair and the
Yes.
assessors?
Yes.
And that you've to be impartial and objective
That's
in
good.
your
Yes.
approach? Thank you. I'd like to move on to your involvement with the inquiry, if I may. The inquiry, I believe, contacted you earlier this year to see if you'd be able to carry out some work for us in relation to the Shekubio inquiry.
That's right, yes.
And we checked to see whether you were conflicted in any way, so to see if you had been involved in any connection with Shekubio's death at any time.
That's right, yes.
And there was no conflict.
There's no conflict. No.
Could we look at your letter of instruction, please? SBPI 00161. So this is dated the 27th of July 2022. You'll see it on the screen, and you've got your hard copy in front of you. And without going through this in too much detail, as we go through the letter, if we could maybe go up, that's fine. You were given some background about the circumstances of the death of Mr. Bio.
I was, yes.
And the terms of reference of the inquiry.
Yes.
And it was explained to you that any report that you did produce would be made available to core participants and their lawyers.
Yes.
And that you would be asked to give oral evidence at this hearing.
That's correct, yes.
And you were sent documents and productions, and we'll actually see those in your report, which we'll come back to in a moment. And was it explained to you, if we can move down the page, please? We'll see the documents mentioned, and then the instructions come up, and we'll just leave those on the screen for a moment. Was it explained to you that the chair of this inquiry would have to be considering evidence about whether or not Mr. Bio had stamped on the back of a female officer as she lay on the ground? And there were issues in relation to that, and your report would be sought to assist the chair in making that decision.
That's right, yes.
And you were asked to examine a vest
Yes.
and some boots that had been taken from Mr. Bio,
Yes.
and some boots that had been taken from a PC walker.
I was, yes.
And you were also sent some photographs of these items.
Yes.
And you were asked to compare the tread on the boots, or the sole, the tread,
Yes.
underneath the boots, and look at some marks that were said to be on the vest.
That's right.
Lovely. Can I have a look at the appendix that was sent along with the letter, or shortly after the letter, SBPI 00163? And if we just very quickly look at that, we can see the physical items listed: the boots, the vest, and something called left boot lift and a right boot lift. Were
Yes.
those acetates of, or lifts?
From what I can recollect, they were photocopies of them.
Photocopies.
So they would have originally been an acetate lift, as I understand it, but I was presented with a photocopy from what I can recollect.
Okay. And then we see that you were also given notes of an examination that had been carried out of the items by the Scottish Police Authority Forensic Services.
I was, yes.
You were sent their report as well.
Yes.
And photographs of the items, and then also statements and transcripts from Laura McPhee, Shirley Chin and Alison Marvin.
I was, yes.
And then we've heard reference with other expert witnesses to Part 35, and is that a summary of the obligations on experts comes from England?
Yes, it is.
And if we can just move up slightly. Can I ask you to look at some items, please, which will be held in a drawer? I'd like to begin with Mr. Biles' boots. And I'd really just like you to confirm that those are the items that you've looked at. So we've got Mr. Biles' boots, PC Walker's boots, and the vest.
Yeah, these are the items I examined, yes.
And the vest as well, yes. Was that
Those were the boots of PC Walker.
the boots of Walker? Yes, please.
Yes. That's the items those I examined.
So that's the vest, Mr. Biles' boots and PC Walker's boots.
That's correct, yes.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Sorry, I should have done that more slowly. It might have been easier. Could we look back at your report, please, which is SBPI 00171. And is it fair to say, before we go to the detail, Mr. Ryder, that this is an accurate summary, your summary of everything you've done for the inquiry?
It is, yes. It is.
And if the chair wishes, he can read further detail within the body of this report.
Yes.
Thank you. If we could move to page 6, please. We'll see that there's a heading, Technical Notes. And there are 8 paragraphs that explain the basis on which you proceeded. And it covers a couple of pages, pages 6 and 7, and I'm going to take you through these in turn if I may. So we'll begin with paragraph 8. And you see that when an item of footwear comes into contact with a surface, a mark is often left. This may be in the form of material transferred from the undersurface of the shoe, or as a result of the shoe removing material from that surface. If there is sufficient contrast between the surface and the material deposited or removed, then the mark produced may be readily visible. Tell us what you mean by sufficient contrast.
It basically means that there is a difference in the material that's deposited and the background. Effectively, if you walked across a black floor and left a black deposit, it'd be very difficult to see, whereas if you walked across the black floor and left white deposits, they'd stand out and be readily visible.
Thank you. You then go on to say, if there is limited or no contrast, then processes or treatments are required to assist in visualising any marks that might be present. Explain what you mean by that.
We can consider a surface. For example, if we were to go to a scene of an incident and we were asked to examine a floor for footwear marks, we would first do a visual examination to see if there was anything obvious that was standing out, and then we would process those, and we would then go through a systematic process of examining the floor, using initially lighting techniques, using lighting from different directions to see whether that introduces contrast, because you can have a floor where you can't actually see a footwear mark because it's dusty on a floor, whereas if the lighting was to be changed and you then shone a light at an angle, a very low angle across it, it would highlight dusty marks really well, even on a floor that you couldn't see previously. Going back to an incident I worked on in Manchester, we'd been looking at marks throughout an address, and it had gone dark, and we were going to come back to do the kitchen the following day, and we hadn't seen any visible marks, but because it had gone dark and we shone a torch across the floor, the whole floor lit up with dusty footwear marks, so we knew we had a big job the next day.
Right. So even marks that are not visible to the naked eye, you have techniques that allow you to see those.
Yes.
And that would allow you to see both any marks that are visible and those invisible to the naked eye marks.
Yes.
Thank you. And when you're carrying out your assessments, you're looking for both the visible and the invisible.
Yes.
Thank you.
Quite often the marks that you can't actually see are the ones that will contain the most detail, that will then provide you with the strongest conclusion in relation to linking an item of footwear.
Thank you. And then if we can move on to paragraph 9. You comment there about the many different types of footwear. How does that help you in your job?
Well, there are many different shoe manufacturers that produce a whole range of different patterns. I mean, if you consider the Nike and Adidas shoes, they've produced thousands of different tread patterns over the years, which are all distinguishable from each other. So you've got a basis on which to do an initial basic comparison, in that you can look at a pattern and you can say that it is a mark of a particular brand or a particular pattern from that brand.
And then in paragraph 10, you mention the significance of changes when shoes or footwear are worn and become worn in areas. Could you explain that?
Well, a shoe, from the minute it comes out of the box to when it's eventually thrown away, is going to be continually changing on its undersurface, because the process of walking erodes the soles, and that introduces character to the undersurface of the shoes in terms of the pattern of the wear, the amount of tread that remains on it, whether tread's been worn away completely. It also introduces features of characteristic damage as a result of the shoe becoming cut from sharp stones. You can get highly characteristic wear patterns as the rubber abrades at a microscopic level. So as the shoe alters, it takes on unique character.
How does that help you in your work?
Well, we consider the class characteristics, which are basically whether the shoe is of the right pattern, is it of the right size. We then look at the general wear to see whether it's worn to a similar general extent, and then we will look to see if there are any features in the mark which we consider to be characteristic and specific to that shoe, which will then allow us to form a strong, if not conclusive, conclusion in relation to whether that shoe has made the mark or not.
Can we look on to page 7 and paragraph 12? You talk about when it's just not possible to exclude an item of footwear from having made a mark, and a conclusive link hasn't been established. Maybe I could read this out and then ask you some questions about it. When it's not possible to exclude an item of footwear from having made a mark and a conclusive link has not been established, it is possible to assess the significance of the findings to form an opinion as to how likely it is that the shoe in question has or has not made the mark. Could you explain that in a little more detail?
Well, if we have a conclusive link, that shoe has definitely made the mark. If we haven't got sufficient character within the mark to allow us to form that opinion, we then consider the likelihood it was that shoe that made the mark, as opposed to it being made by another shoe. So we take into account the size factors, the wear factors, how much discrimination can be achieved based on those features that we're seeing, and whether there are any features there that are detracting from the significance of the findings, which might tend to suggest it's not that shoe, as opposed to pointing to the conclusion that the support for the view that it has made that mark.
So if someone has worn shoes for a while, and you talked about standing on stones, maybe a stone's left a hole, that character could provide a conclusive link.
Yes, if you've sufficient character, yes.
In the absence of that, if it's simply a new pair of shoes, then it could be the same as a number of new pair of shoes from a particular brand.
Yes.
And you won't be able to provide a conclusive link.
Not a conclusive link, but there are features that you can observe that will allow you to distinguish between two shoes that look effectively the same. You could have two shoes produced by the same manufacturer with the same pattern and be of the same size, but the footwear has actually come out of a different mould and would have different characteristics that have manifested itself in the mark which relate to the mould. But it still would be that any other shoe that had come out of that specific mould could have made that mark as well.
So even very small, fine differences in detail will be observed by you and noted?
They can be if it's in the mark, yes.
So if there are those details, you will note them down?
Yes.
Thank you. And then you say, in assessing the significance of any correspondences or differences found between a shoe and a mark resulting from a comparison, the likelihood of obtaining the observed correspondences or differences are considered against two alternative propositions. I'd quite like you to explain this, please, so that people can understand what you're saying.
What we're doing is we're considering the likelihood of our observations and findings given one proposition that the shoe had made the mark. So we consider all the findings against that proposition. We also then consider the findings against an alternative, effectively completely opposite proposition, that the findings have arisen as a result of the shoe not having made that mark. And you weigh those up based on your experience and knowledge and the information available to you to see which you, as an expert, think is the more likely to explain the findings that you have.
And so that's the propositions that you list in paragraph 12.
That's correct, yes.
First of all, A, the shoe in question has made the mark it has been compared with.
Yes.
And you're looking for similarities or areas of areas where you can see there's a consistency.
Yes.
And B, the shoe has not made the mark. And that's the other proposition you see. This shoe hasn't made this mark. What are the differences?
It's not necessarily the differences, it's also the likelihood of a coincidental correspondence. If there may be another shoe that shares the same characteristics, what's the likelihood of another shoe sharing the same characteristics that you're seeing in that particular mark as well?
Right, thank you. Then paragraph 13, the strength of the assessment of the footwear mark evidence is normally expressed as a level of support for one or other of the above two propositions. Could you explain that?
We have a verbal scale which we apply to that in terms of there is weak support, moderately strong support, and it goes up through very strong and extremely strong support. And it's an approach which attempts to introduce some consistency into which way people express the conclusions.
Thank you. And the assessment is based on the observations made during the comparison and the experience of the examiner and any data that may be available to complement the assessment of the findings.
That's correct, yes.
And when you say that at the end, the data that's available, is that information that's provided to you or gathered in by you at a scene?
And it goes beyond that in the wider information in terms of information we know about the manufacture of shoes, those particular shoes that we're considering, how frequently that type of shoes encountered. It may be that we get sales information from manufacturers that help us to say how common a particular shoe might be amongst the market, and it's all the background information around that, plus the experience of the actual examiner from carrying out these examinations.
And are you gathering in that information from manufacturers or sellers and such like?
We collect information about the frequency of occurrence that we encounter footwear generally, but on occasions we may go beyond that, depending on the nature of the case. There may be occasions where we actually go and do the inquiries, or the police would do that on our behalf.
Thank you. And then paragraph 14, in order to form a view, the examiner of the mark must have confidence that the pattern elements that they are considering can be attributed to footwear of the pattern type in question, and relies on any correspondences or differences in the spatial arrangement and definition of other parts of the mark surrounding each considered feature. In instances where the considered mark is so poorly defined that it cannot be established that the mark relates to an item of footwear of that pattern type, and or it is not possible to discern whether it has been made by an alternative item, the marks are considered to be unsuitable for comparison. Now, I wonder if we can just go through this paragraph. You said that in order to form a view, the examiner of the marks must have confidence that the pattern elements that they are considering can be attributed to footwear of the type in question. What do you mean must have confidence?
It's your observation in that it needs to be clearly defined or sufficiently defined for those features to be discerned and to be seen. If the mark is very poorly defined, you may not have that character showing through. You can have a mark that's been made by a shoe that's been deposited on a surface, and because it's so smudged you can't actually see the pattern elements that are present on the shoe that had made the mark. You can be confident it's been made by a shoe because of the shape of it, but there's nothing there which would allow you to say, well, it's an Adidas shoe, or it's a Nike shoe, or it's a Doc Martin or something like that, because there's just no features within the mark which allow you to form that opinion.
And what can cause a mark to be poorly defined?
It can be the way that it's made, the nature of the substrate it's been deposited on.
Sorry, the nature of what?
The substrate that it's been deposited on.
Is that the substance?
Yes. If it's a smooth surface, it'd be expected to take an impression with more detail, whereas if it's a textured surface, there's obviously raised parts of the surface, and those are the parts that will only come into contact with the shoe. There's also how much the shoe would move at the time it's making the mark, whether it slips as it deposits it, the nature of the material and the amount of material that might be on the shoe at the time. All these things are factors which could influence how well defined a mark might be, or how poorly defined it might be.
And could it also be the force with which the contact is made?
That can alter the way the appearance of the mark. It can impart features which look like the shoe is actually more worn than it actually is, because you've increased the amount of pressure that's applied. Plus, because it's a dynamic process, the shoe can move as a result and smudge and smear as a result of that, and obscure any detail that might otherwise have been there.
Thank you. And then you go on to say, in the same paragraph 14, that this relies on correspondences or differences in the spatial arrangement and definition of other parts of the mark surrounding each considered feature. I wonder if you could explain what that means. What's a spatial arrangement?
Well, each undersurface pattern has a number of pattern elements, and they are spaced out at set margins, and that will be dependent on the size of the shoe. But what you would consider is that if you've got part of one feature here that relates to a particular shoe, is the next pattern element in the right place next to it, or is it further away, or is it present at all, or is it not? So you're not just considering one feature, you're considering whether there's all the surrounding features appearing in there as well, or indications of those features, or or an absence of them. So you're sort of taking a whole picture. Not sure I'm explaining that very well, but
No, but if, for example, you had a shoe with diamonds or pyramid shapes on it in an even pattern, would you be looking for a consistency among that as a spatial arrangement?
you'd be looking to recognise the rest of the pattern. You wouldn't just be identifying single features. You'd be looking at the pattern as an entirety, and then once you've identified that there is a pattern there that you're considering, whether the pattern elements are the right spacing, whether they're the right shape, and features like that.
So if the tread of the shoe had, for example, 8 shapes on it, and you could only see one, would that cause you a difficulty in your job?
If you could be satisfied that it was that particular shape and it had a well-defined outline and there was detail within it, such as a unique characteristic feature, you could form an opinion that was conclusive based on a relatively small area of a mark. But if you can only see such an element, or what might be an element, and there's nothing surrounding it, and you can't be 100% certain that you've got definite outlines and that it's a definite shape, you have to be much more cautious in your approach to the opinions you might draw.
So would this impact on the confidence that you mention in line 1 of paragraph 14?
Yes. I mean, if you can see it's definitely a square, and it's a square block, you can say it's definitely a square block. If it's just a smudge with no character and perhaps one straight line associated with it and a bit of a smudge around it, you can't be satisfied that that's a square block.
So you wouldn't be saying it's definitely not the same, you just can't
There's just no...
be confident.
Yeah, there's just insufficient character for us to undertake a meaningful comparison and to take the examination forward.
Thank you. And so at the end of this paragraph, where you said unsuitable for comparison, let me just read that sentence again. In instances where the considered mark is so poorly defined that it cannot be established that the mark relates to an item of footwear of that pattern type, and or it is not possible to discern whether it has been made by an alternative item, the marks are considered to be unsuitable for comparison. And is that where you simply can't carry out that comparison with confidence?
That's right, yes. You look at the mark and there's no indication or information in there to say, is it a shoe? Is it this shoe? Is it another shoe? Is it a shoe at all? You know, so if you're presented with that situation, there's just nothing for you to compare as an expert and to give an opinion on.
So there may be all sorts of possibilities, but in your role as an expert, you wouldn't want to speculate on those?
No.
Thank you. Can we move on, please, to the next page, page 8. And we see here that it says examination and results, examination of the boots of Shekubayo. And this is covered in paragraphs 15 to 19 of your report. I wonder if you could just give a summary of how you carried out your examination of the boots.
Okay. Well, initially, we set a strategy to ensure that our examination didn't impact on the other examinations that were going to be undertaken, which, namely those undertaken by Dr. Lorna Dawson. So those were initially undertaken under her direction to recover all the trace evidence from the boots before I even examined them. Following that process, we examined the boots to identify the pattern type, the size of the shoes, the condition of them. We then produced what we would call test marks, which is effectively producing footprints with the shoes, and develop those and then use those to make transparencies, which we could then use as part of the comparison process with any marks we might have.
I'd like to take you through this a little bit more slowly, if that's possible. Okay. So you mentioned Professor Dawson. We heard from her on Tuesday.
Yes.
And she said that in any investigation where that involves multiple forensic sciences, then it's very important that they're done in the most appropriate sequence of analysis. From her part in the recovery of soil, she said, the part that I would take to recover the samples that I was to look at involves removing that. So removing soil or any other trace material from the vest. And that would mean that any potential mark would be affected by the removal of the soil. So on the other hand, it wouldn't affect my recovery at all, but the work that would be done to examine the trace. So the priority order was the examination of the marks and then the recovery of the soil. And it was asked, if you'd done your work first, is there a possibility it might have got in the way of cell marks' own analysis? And she said it might have affected the quality of the marks that they were to examine. And do you understand that?
In relation to the vest, that is true, because if you remove material, you're removing the material which is forming part of the marks. So in relation to the marks, we did the examination first to make sure we got a full record of anything that was present on the vest before Dr. Dawson did her examination of the vest. But in relation to the boots, because we had to make test impressions with the boots, that could potentially remove the evidence that she wanted to look at from the boots themselves during that process. So in that case, we set the strategy to recover that material before we made the test marks.
So Professor Dawson recovered her material from the boots first?
Yes.
To give her the best results of what she was doing?
Yes.
And in relation to the vest, she delayed recovering the substance until you had had your opportunity to consider it.
That's correct, yes.
Thank you. And it was done that way because the order in which things can be done can have an impact on the people coming after you.
It can, yes.
Thank you. And were you aware that the Scottish Police Authority Forensic Services had carried out examinations prior to you and Professor Dawson?
I was, from the documents that have been provided, yes.
Yes. We also asked Professor Dawson about the period of time between the events, which was 2015, the 3rd of May, and her examination. And I'd be interested in any comments you have, Mr. Ryder, about the period of time between the 3rd of May 2015 and when you carried out your examinations for the purposes of this report. Professor Dawson said the minimum time period for the integrity of the item is the shortest period at all possible, and to have that being witnessed, so the least could have occurred to that questioned item in the intervening time. That's the ideal situation. Would you agree that the minimum period of time between the events and the examination is the ideal situation?
Yes. In an ideal world, you'd want to be doing your examinations as soon as you can, but you have to prioritise according to the strategy in relation to everything else. So it comes at the point where it needs to come.
So then can we move on, please? To paragraph 18. When you examined the boots, you noted that the undersurfaces or soles of the boots bore a complex pattern comprising a central arrangement of pairs of triangles surrounded by chevron-shaped blocks. And the undersurfaces were relatively well worn, with some areas of the soles being worn to the extent that the lattice of the midsole was visible in the copies of the marks provided to me that had been prepared by Scottish Police Authority Forensic Services. I wonder if I could ask you to look at some items, please. SPA 00024, and SPA 00025. So we've heard evidence about these items. Sorry. So this is SPA 00024. This is right boot acetate that we've heard evidence about previously. And I just wonder if, as we look at that picture, if you could maybe point out the areas that you're describing in paragraph 18. So the complex pattern with a central arrangement of pairs of triangles surrounded by chevron-shaped blocks.
Yes.
And I should say, and I wasn't planning on doing this with you, but it may be easier, if you touch the screen at any point, a red circle can appear,
Okay.
if that makes life easier in terms of describing.
Okay.
And if you get it in the wrong place, you can put your finger back on it and drag it. Or we can have Miss Wildgoose remove it if that's easier.
That is one of the pairs of central triangular blocks which are across the sole, and there are also two further pairs in the heel.
Those are the chevron-shaped
blocks
that you
Yes.
mentioned. And you mentioned triangles. Are they made up of two triangles?
Yes, that's circle number 1.
Circle. And what's two?
2 is the chevron blocks, it's covering part of the chevron block, but each of those up the inner and outside are what I'm describing as chevron-shaped blocks.
Oh. So the pairs of triangles are number 1,
Yes.
and 2 are the chevron-shaped blocks.
Yeah, it's a representation of one of them, yes.
And it says the undersurfaces were relatively well worn, with some areas of the soles being worn to the extent that the lattice of the midsole was visible in the copies of the marks provided to me. Could you explain what you're describing there? What's the lattice of the midsole?
Well, the outside of the sole has the pattern on it, but there's actually an inner part which is basically a lattice pattern, which the insert or the insole will sit on top of within the shoe. So if you were to peel the insole up, you'd be able to see the top of the sole itself, and quite often that will have a lattice pattern on it. And if we just I'm putting circles.
We can take those away, or we can.
If you take 3 and 4 away.
I think we'll just have to take them all away.
All right,
those
okay.
3, the 3 of those away, and you
Okay,
can start again.
I'll try again.
You can drag that number 3.
Right. That is showing what would have originally been a chevron block, but there's a white cross effectively across the mark, and that is the lattice underneath the sole actually influencing part of that mark, and the sole, because of the pressure, has worn away that part of the shoe more. So if you don't have sufficient pressure to make that bit still make contact with the ground, it will appear as a void within the mark, and that's basically a void created by the lattice.
And is that what you described earlier in your evidence as the wear and tear of or worn areas providing the character that you're looking for?
Yes. If you look at the actual chevron blocks, the ones in number 2 have a surface texture pattern on them, whereas the ones on the outer side of the shoe, they're at number 4, don't have that texture on, because that texture has been completely worn away. And then it's been worn to the extent where, again, you're starting to see the voids coming through from the lattice underneath.
So we can see a comparison in red circle 2, we can see the pattern on the chevron
Yes.
to the left on the outside of the sole. But in 4, it looks like a darker, the pattern isn't visible.
That's correct. That pattern would have been on all of those blocks when that shoe had been new.
So it's wear and tear that's caused that variation.
Yes.
And that's the sort of character that you
Yeah.
were talking about earlier.
Yes.
Thank you. And then at paragraph 19, if we could for a moment go back to your report. Sorry, this is on page 8. Paragraph 19. Further test impressions were made with these boots by myself, and it was from these impressions that transparent overlays were produced for the purpose of comparison with marks on the submitted police vest as per the instructions. And again, I wonder if you could look for me, please, at SBPI 00209.
Yeah.
Do you recognise this?
Yes.
Is this the item that you describe, the test impression that was made by yourself?
It is, yes.
And so these were carried out separately, and we can see the details on the left-hand side at the bottom.
Yes.
And these are of Mr. Bio's, or one of Mr. Bio's shoes.
That's correct, yes.
And again, can you show us the chevron, please? Oh, sorry.
The chevron is there.
Right. And the triangles?
The triangles are there.
And the worn area on the heel area, which shows the... Thank you. Thank you very much. Why did you do your own?
The test impressions I were provided with were photocopies, but they didn't actually contain a scale, so I couldn't reproduce them to actual size. So to undertake a comparison and to be satisfied that they were actual size, I produced my own test prints.
How does it help you if you're having them made to actual size?
Well, part of the comparison is to see whether the shoe that you're considering is the same size as the shoe that has deposited the mark. So they both have to be reproduced as exactly as possible to the same scale, so that you can do a like-for-like comparison.
And that is what you were attempting to do with your work?
Yes.
Thank you. I'm conscious of the time. I know we started later.
I think what we'll do, Ms. Graham, since we started later, is carry on till 11:45, and then we'll take a 15-minute break.
Can I move back to your report for a moment, please? And if we could look at paragraph 20 on page 8. And this now turns on to the examination of the boots of PC Craig Walker, which you've already identified for us. And again, was there any difference between the way you examined these boots and the way you examined the previous boots from Mr. Bio?
No, there wasn't.
And did you also carry out some impressions or test impressions in the same way you had previously?
I did, yes.
And you prepared transparent overlays from them also?
Yes.
And then can we move on, please, to page 9? And do we also see that you then did an examination of the police vest of PC Nicole Short?
Yes.
And can you explain to us how you went about examining the vest?
We undertook a visual examination of the vest and used, well, we recorded what we could see visually using cameras and scales. Then we used a range of different lighting techniques to try to enhance any marks that might be present, and recorded that, and used a range of filters with the lighting techniques and within the software that we have for printing the marks to actual size, to try to maximise the amount of detail that we could see on the vest.
So you looked at the front and back and the inside of the vest?
Yes.
Round the armholes?
Yes.
And you described earlier how you're looking for things that are visible to the naked eye, but then you're also looking for things that might not be visible to the naked eye.
That's correct, yes.
And you did all of that when you looked at the vest?
Yes.
And we have heard evidence that the vest contains an inside black portion and then a high visibility yellow with silver strip over vest, if you like, on top. Is that what you found?
Yes. Well, when it was presented to us at Cellmark, the items have been separated out. The black vest was within the bag, and the yellow vest was within a separate polythene bag within the item itself. So they've been separated.
Right. Thank you. And in paragraph 25, you mention the black protective vest, police vest, a torch, a leather strap and a sheet of brown paper that I understand was the sheet of paper that this item had been examined on prior to submission for my consideration. And did you examine the bag, the bit of paper as well?
No, we didn't examine that. I understand that was just what would have been used to collect anything that had fallen from the item when it was previously examined, and therefore it wasn't relevant to the examinations I was undertaking.
Thank you. And you also see the yellow high visibility fluorescent police vest was in a further polythene bag.
Yes.
You note that no marks were on the black vest,
That's correct.
visible or not visible to the naked eye.
Yes, from the examinations undertaken, we didn't see any.
Were you looking for footwear marks only, or were you just looking for marks?
We were looking for footwear marks that could be identified as footwear.
All right. And then at 27, I'd like to go through this paragraph in some detail. The fluorescent vest was examined, so the yellow vest.
Yes.
A number of dark coloured deposits were observed on the fluorescent fabric at the rear right of this vest, at the juncture of the vertical and horizontal reflective strips of the vest. I wonder if we could, just for a moment, look at some photographs, and it may be easier to, or let's begin first of all with ones that you were sent with the appendix to your letter of instruction, photos at PERC 01176. And I'm interested in photographs 10 and 12 on the PDF. So this is photograph 10, I think, which is RES 32 JPEG. And then if we can move on to 12. And this is RES 0034. Those are two photographs.
Yes.
Can we look at the first one, 10, please? And do you see the marks there that are visible?
Yes.
And would you point those out to us with the red circle?
Well, they cover quite an area, but that's part of it. There are other marks around here and here.
So you were examining all of those marks?
Yes.
And is photograph 12 a close-up of that area? If we can go back to photograph 12.
It is, yes.
Thank you. And again, so we can see the marks a little more clearly in that photograph 12.
Yes.
And what I'll do is I'll read out part of the report, and then we can go back to those photographs if we need to. So this is on page 9, paragraph 12. Sorry, 27. So a number of dark coloured deposits were observed on the fluorescent fabric at the rear right of the vest, at the juncture of the vertical and horizontal reflective strips. These deposits continued onto the fabric part of the horizontal reflective strip. There was black staining to the plastic coated aspects of the reflective strips and to the police badge on the rear of the vest. Now I'd like to move on to two other photographs, please, before I ask you to explain this. These are taken from a PowerPoint presentation that we looked at on Tuesday with Professor Dawson, which is SBPI 191. And it is slide 13 that I'm interested in. And this is a photograph. When we heard from Professor Dawson on Tuesday, she showed us a picture of the 1995 photographs that were taken, and she showed us a picture of this, which we heard from her was taken in 2022, and showed the results of the vest after fingerprint staining had been applied to the vest. Is this the black staining that you're talking about?
It is,
in your
yes.
Paragraph. So we heard from Professor Dawson that photographs were looked at by her that were taken in 95 before any forensic tests had been carried out.
Yes.
And that was the, if I can say, cleaner looking version of the vest, the one we just looked at, photographs 10 and 12.
Yes.
With the black marks quite visible on the right side of the vest, beside the strip. And then this photograph shows how it arrived in your premises at Cellmark in 2022.
That's correct, yes.
So this was after a number of forensic tests had been carried out.
Yes.
So you recognise this photo as well?
Yes.
So thank you. If we can go back to paragraph 27 of your report. And that's on page 9. And so where you say there was black staining to the plastic coated aspects of the reflective strips and to the police badge on the rear of the vest, that's from black staining from the fingerprint examination previously carried out by SPA, as you understand it.
Yes, as I understand it, yes.
Thank you. And you say there, I understand this staining was the result of treating these parts of the vest with a black powder suspension with a view to developing any fingerprints that might be present. As a consequence of this treatment being applied as a liquid and then having to be removed by a washing process, parts of the yellow fluorescent fabric adjacent to the treated areas have been stained black. This includes the part of the vest on which the dark deposits had been observed. To what extent did that have an impact on your work, Mr. Ryder?
It obscured part of the detail that was originally present, and obviously made the comparison that I was asked to undertake more difficult.
To what extent would it have been easier if you'd had the opportunity to examine the vest before fingerprint analysis was carried out?
Well, we've been able to see the mark in its original condition, and to see it before any detail had been lost or obscured as a result of the processes that were undertaken.
So how did you work around that in your assessment of the marks?
I reviewed the reports and statements and notes that had been provided in relation to the examinations that had previously been undertaken to understand the processes that had gone on, and to look at to see if there was any records of the mark that were more detailed, that showed the mark in its pristine condition, or as near to it as we could get, and to request one of those images to work with to carry out the comparison.
And was that the 1995 photographs? That,
Sorry, 2015, yes.
oh, sorry,
yeah. Yes.
That was my mistake, 2015.
Yeah.
And so it was those marks that showed the vest that gave a better indication for you to use?
It was the clearest representation of those marks that I could find that was available.
And did you rely on that photograph, those images?
I did, yes.
Right. Was that a better approach than looking at the vest as it was in 2022?
There was more detail present to consider, because not only had part of the marks been obscured as a result of that, it was evident from looking at that original photograph and the vest itself that the deposits appeared lighter in colour or fainter at the time we were given them. And I took that to be that it was because the deposits were so fragile that as a result of the continued examination, that part of those deposits had been lost from the vest prior to it being examined by me.
And how, in your experience, can those items be lost over time?
Because they're quite fragile and sitting on the surface of the garment, any friction or contact with that would result in those deposits being potentially removed. So, for example, folding it up to put it back in the bag after an examination has been completed would be one way in which such a process could damage the marks. And I understand that this has been examined by a number of people over a number of different ways, so it would have been in and out of the bag on a number of occasions, and unavoidably that detail has been lost as a result of those processes.
Thank you. Would now be a...
Yes, we'll take a 15-minute break now. Ms. Graham.
We were talking about paragraph 27 of your report on page 9. And if we can look at that again for a moment. Just below halfway down, you'll see that it says, as a consequence of this treatment being applied, so you'd been mentioning the staining with the black powder suspension, the fingerprint analysis that had been done previously. As a consequence of this treatment being applied as a liquid and then having to be removed by a washing process, parts of the yellow fluorescent fabric adjacent to the treated areas have been stained black. We looked at that in the photograph.
Yes.
Immediately before the break. And this includes the part of the vest on which the dark deposits had been observed.
Yes.
I'd like to ask you about the washing process. In your experience, do you understand what that washing process involves?
Well, the powder suspension process, as I understand it, is basically it's a thick black sludge liquid which is painted onto the surface they want to treat, and then it reacts with fingerprints. That's what they're trying to develop. The powder within the suspension will stick to the fingerprints, and then when you wash it off, it washes away the excess sludge or whatever you want to look at the suspension to leave behind and expose the fingerprints that have reacted. But because it's a liquid, it's very difficult to control where that is going to go when you're doing the washing process.
So that can have an impact on the mark, can it?
Well, it has done in this case, yes.
Yes. And can I ask you to comment on some evidence that we heard from Professor Dawson? Perhaps we could look at SBPI 00191, which was a PowerPoint presentation that she gave us on Tuesday.
Mm-hmm.
And I'd like to look, first of all, at a number of slides, first starting with 14. So you'll see that this is we heard that this was a photograph of the vest. You'll recognise it.
Yes.
And you'll see that there are 3 areas identified there, 1, 2 and 3 with circles.
Yes.
I'm going to be asking you some questions about area 1. Can we look on at 15? You'll see that there are little red markers that have been applied to the areas.
Yes.
Again, 1 is at the bottom of the silver strip, fluorescent strip on the
Yes.
vest. And then 16, you'll see samples that were recovered from the vest, and again you can just see the little red markers showing a close-up of these areas. Again, area 1 at the bottom is the one I'm going to ask you about. You'll see the mark there. And then if we can move on to slide 19, which is area 1, and it's a close-up. So this is from the soil on the silver strip, fluorescent strip on the vest that we've looked at. And you'll see at the bottom. Now, Professor Dawson talked about area 1 being at the lower edge of the silver fluorescent strip. You can see a little bit of the yellow fabric beneath it, just between the marker and the strip. You see that?
Yes.
And she said it looked as if it had been wiped or something. And she was asked to give a description of what had maybe caused that appearance. And she said, is this sort of regular appearance at the top, or there's a strip that is above the deposit that appears like something has been there that is no longer adhering to the fabric? I just wondered if you could comment on whether this washing process that you've described could cause anything like this, or could it be some other?
It would depend what the deposits were, whether it could just be the friction that I referred to before by folding it, or whether the fact that you've run water over the item. You'd expect the water to be run over the areas where the suspension had been applied, and to try to avoid all the other areas that you're not treating, to try to preserve them as best you can. But again, I wouldn't be able to say whether that was a result of washing or whether that was just mechanical removal as a result of repeated examinations.
Thank you. I'd like to move on to paragraph 29, please, of your report, which is on page 10. I think you've touched on this earlier today. You requested further electronic copies, and you've given the details of those there, of
Yes.
Images. And you talk about the vest photocopy has been reproduced at this lab to actual size to represent the dark staining at the time prior to the treatments that have unavoidably impacted on the visualization of these deposits. I'm interested in this photo that's been reproduced to actual size. Could you explain what you did?
Well, the image itself has got a scale in it. So what we do is, using the computer software that we use then to print, is we calculate the size of the image and we work it out so that the image, when it's printed out, will be 1-to-1 size, and a centimetre on the scale will be a centimetre in the print. So we calculate how to do that and then print it out to actual size.
So whatever size the item is, you have an image that is actual size?
Yes.
Thank you. And you say records of the deposits at the time of my examination have also been made by photographing them under a range of lighting conditions and using filters to try to enhance the appearance of these deposits. Describe what you were doing there.
It's basically the vest as it was presented to me was rephotographed, and we experimented with different lighting and different filters, trying to find the best way to increase the contrast between the background and the mark, so that to make it as visible as we possibly could, to try to create some detail, not create, but to show the detail that's there in its best way, so that it would assist our comparison the most.
And then you say, it was my opinion that the item, the photograph 34, was the clearest representation of the deposits under consideration. And I think that's what you mentioned earlier. I called them photographs 10 and 12, but the photograph 12 was the closer up photograph. You thought that was the clearest representation of the deposits.
It was, yes.
Thank you. And you say no detail was observed beyond that recorded in this image that would, in my view, further assist in addressing the matters subject to my instructions.
Yes.
Thank you. If we move on to paragraph 30, you say I've considered the recorded deposits to determine whether there is any pattern to them that I consider could relate to a pattern element from an item of footwear. No features were present that I can be satisfied are geometric shapes that I would expect to see if they were related to an item of footwear being brought down in forceful contact with this vest. Could you explain that in a little more detail, please?
What we're looking for is to see if there is any pattern to the marks themselves, to those deposits. If there is anything in there which is pointing towards it being a footwear mark, are there any geometric shapes? Is there an arrangement of square blocks, an arrangement of triangles, arrangement of hexagons, whatever the tread pattern might have been, or anything that you might recognise from experience of looking at other footwear that looks like a footwear mark, and that's what we were looking for in that instance.
And you say that no features were present that satisfied you that there were those geometric shapes.
That's correct, yes.
And you say I have explored the arrangement of deposits further by positioning actual size transparent representations of the footwear patterns in multiple positions over the marks to determine if there is any spatial correspondence between the features in the marks on the vest and those on the respective pairs of footwear. Can you explain what you were doing?
The impressions that we've seen previously, that we'd actually produced, you could transfer them onto a clear acetate sheet. So you've actually got a transparency of the footprint I've got one here if it would assist.
Is this from your own folder of materials?
Yes. If you're happy for...
I-
Yes.
Yes.
So that is effectively what's produced. So you can then put that down on top of the photograph and move it around to try to find whether there's any correspondence that you can see between that and the deposits on the actual photograph.
And that's an actual size
It is actual size, yes.
of the transparency, and you had the actual size of the photograph
Yes.
of the original images.
Yes.
And you did a comparison by visually moving them about and checking to see.
Yes.
And you say that no such correlation was found that I would consider to be indicative of these deposits having resulted from a contact with the sole of either of these pairs of boots.
That's correct, yes.
And was that the boots of Mr. Bio
Yes.
and PC Walker?
Yes.
And so you couldn't find any items in the transparency and from the sole of the boots that corresponded with the vest?
I couldn't find the correspondence, no.
Thank you. And you've also mentioned there that, to go back to the second line, no features were present that I can be satisfied are geometric shapes that I would expect to see if they were related to an item of footwear being brought down in forceful contact with this vest. I'm interested in the use of that, in forceful contact. What were you thinking of when you described in forceful contact?
Well, I understand that we were, from the instruction provided, that we're investigating the potential that someone had stamped on this vest. So I understand the stamp to be someone bringing down the undersurface of the shoe in a forceful way, which increases the amount of pressure that is applied when the shoe makes contact with the surface it's coming into contact with.
If there had not been a forceful contact between the sole of the shoe and the vest, such as a stamp, but perhaps a less forceful movement or a less clearly defined movement of some sort between the shoe and the vest, could that have caused any of the marks that you saw on the vest?
It would depend on the extent of the contact and the extent of contact with the part of it. The deposits cover quite a large area. So if it was a single contact and they've all been put down at the same time, there is no correlation between any of the footwear that I've seen and those shoes in that mark. And there is no features in the entirety as a whole which would support the view that it is a footprint, in my opinion. But if you were to take one particular element of it, then I wouldn't be able to rule out that it could have been caused by part of that shoe. But it would have to be deposited in a way that it leaves a mark that isn't recognisable as being left by that shoe.
Right. Thank you. And then if we can look at paragraph 31. As part of my examination, I have taken into account that the deposits have been left on a textured fabric surface, which has the potential to impact on the clarity and detail recorded in any impressions left. Could you explain a little more about that?
In reaching the conclusion about whether it's a footwear mark or not, you have to take into account the substrate in which the mark's been deposited on. And because it's a textured surface, the expectation is there would be less detail within the mark. So, that said, an element of caution was taken against completely eliminating the possibility that it was a shoe, because you're not dealing with an ideal situation.
And then you go on to say, I've also been asked to consider whether the marks are the consequence of a forceful dynamic motion. Is this the stamp that you were talking about a moment ago?
Yes.
which in my experience would have the potential to distort any impressions left. In what way could a forceful dynamic motion distort impressions left?
You can get a situation where the shoe moves as it deposits the mark. It could rock the fabric up and crease it and alter the appearance of what deposits might be left behind. It might alter the appearance of the actual mark produced itself because of the additional impact that's applied, and change the features slightly that you might expect from that particular shoe.
Then nonetheless, I have seen no detail during my examinations that allow me to form a view that these deposits have been left as a result of a contact with the sole of an item of footwear, and in particular, either of the considered items of footwear. And that included Mr. Bio's boots?
Yes.
And those from PC Walker?
That's correct, yes.
So you'd seen no detail during your examinations that allowed you to express the view that the deposits were left as a result of contact with the soles of those boots?
That's correct, yes.
Now, you've mentioned the forceful dynamic motion. Again, if the marks were caused not by a forceful dynamic motion such as a stamp, but perhaps a less forceful dynamic motion, would that cause you to alter any of the views you've expressed?
You would take it into account, but it doesn't alter the opinion that there's nothing within those marks that I can see that would allow me to form a view that they've been made by either of those pairs of shoes, or indeed that it's a footwear mark.
Thank you. And then in paragraph 32, you say, given the nature of the marks, it is also my view that I'm not able to exclude the possibility that either of the submitted pairs of footwear could have contributed to this deposited material in some way, but that contribution is so indistinct that it is not recognisable as having been made by an item of footwear. And so can you just tell us what that means?
It means that the marks are so indistinct that I can't rule out the possibility that a shoe could have made that mark but left a deposit that it's so indistinct that you can't recognise what you're seeing. It just isn't recognisable as a footwear mark to me, and I see no elements in there that correlate with either of the submitted pairs of shoes.
And so if we've heard evidence that there was a foot mark or tread mark on the rear of this vest, that's not your view as you've expressed in your opinion?
There is nothing that I have seen that would assist in scientifically in assisting whether that is a footprint and or whether it's either of these pairs of shoes.
Thank you. And then in paragraph 33, you say, overall, it is therefore my opinion there is insufficient definition and detail within the marks on the vest to be able to carry out a meaningful comparison with the submitted footwear, and or to be able to offer an opinion as to the nature of the surface these deposits have been transferred from. And does this go back to what you were saying earlier in terms of a meaningful comparison and not having the confidence to be able to say one way or the other?
It does go back to that, and it's a case of there's no character within the marks that would allow me to see what might have caused it. Whether it's a shoe, whether it's contact with a pattern on a grid from the floor, whether it's contact with a bench, and it could be that there are many different things that could have caused it, and I wouldn't be able to offer opinion whether it was more likely any of those items, unless there was a correlation found with one of those.
Thank you. Can we look at paragraph 34, please? So this is at the top of page 11. I'd like to ask you some questions about this paragraph. Let's start to go through it. Had the marks or part of it been produced by an item of footwear making forceful contact with PC Nicole Short while she lay on the ground, there is, in my opinion, a further expectation of a possible transfer of material to the parts of her vest that were in contact with the ground, particularly if the ground was wet. Could you explain what you mean by that?
In terms of that, it's a sort of equal and opposite forces in that if someone was to be lay on the ground and a mark was to be deposited on top of them on the opposite side to where they were lay on the ground, you would expect deposits from the shoe, but you'd also expect deposits from the ground at the same time if they were in contact with it.
And so when you're talking about forceful contact, are you envisaging a stamp?
Yes, in terms of a foot forcibly being put down, yes.
So if a stamp or multiple stamps had been applied to the rear of the vest, you would expect something on the front.
There's certainly a potential for that if it was in contact with the ground, yes.
And then you say this would most likely be to the front or left side of the vest if the mark on the right side was a result of someone stamping on her. Could you explain what you mean by that?
In terms of that, the envisage that you're bringing your foot directly down. So given the position of the marks on the vest on the rear right side, the opposite side of the vest would be the left side. So that would be the pit that is in contact with the ground if it were to come directly down on top of the vest at that point.
If you were wearing a vest now, Mr. Ryder, and the mark was on the rear, on the right of the rear, as you looked at it, so perhaps underneath your right arm, where would you have expected a corresponding mark to be on the vest?
You'd expect some contact on this side. So it's the opposite side to where the contact with the shoe would make. If that is in contact with the ground, as a result of the stamp, then you might expect to see deposits on that side as well.
Now, if we were looking at, if you were wearing a vest now and we were looking at that, I would have said the left of the vest would be on this side and the right would be on this side, and you're pointing to the opposite of what I would expect. I want to be clear I've got this right.
So when I refer to right and left, I always refer to it as the right and left of the wearer.
Right, okay. So if the mark, if you were wearing the vest that we've seen, where were the marks on that vest if you were wearing the vest?
It would be on my right side here.
Your right side. You're pointing to your side.
Yes.
Rather than the rear, rather than your back.
Refer to the image.
Would you like to look at one of the images again? We've got
Please.
10 and 12, which might
That's fine.
help.
Yes.
So that's, let's have a look at image 10. I don't want to get confused about this. So this is the rear of the police vest that we've been talking about.
Yes.
Now, as I look at that, I see marks on the right-hand side.
Yes.
Yes. Beside the right arm hole.
Yes.
And if we turned that vest around, where would we see the... I don't know if we have a photo of the front of the vest, actually. In this, see, oh yes, here we are, perfect. So we look at this, we've turned the vest around now, we're looking at the front. Where would you have expected marks to be?
The bit that's on the opposite side, as I would consider it, would be around this area.
Right, so let's go back to the previous photograph of the rear, which is photo 10. Sorry. All right. And so that's beside the rear of the vest, beside the arm.
Yes.
And you would expect it to be, if it was a stamp straight down, you would expect it to be on that point where you added the red circle.
Round about there, yes.
Do you have an understanding of the position in which the officer who was wearing this vest was on the ground?
I haven't been provided with that in detail, but it's in terms of if it was, because it's been described as a stamp, I was taking that to be a direct downward movement.
Thank you. So if the chair takes a different view, then that might impact on where the front mark would be expected to be.
Yes.
Thank you.
Yes.
Thanks. Can we go back to your report, please? Paragraph 34. You've said no significant deposits of dirt were observed during my examination of the vest or from examination of photographs of the vest provided to me. And I think earlier you gave evidence that you'd examined the whole vest front and back.
Yes.
And so does that suggest no significant deposits of dirt were observed? Is that including on the front of the vest?
Yes.
Thank you. The absence of such deposits could, in my opinion, be considered to support the view that she had not been lying on the ground when the alleged stamp occurred, resulting in the staining that has been the subject of my examinations.
Yes.
Thank you. I have, however, been made aware that items of police equipment, including her radio and utility belt, were also being worn with this vest.
Yes.
As such, I am unable to rule out the possibility that this equipment may have prevented a contact occurring between the ground and the vest, and therefore precluding the transfer of material to it. This further consideration, therefore, in my opinion, also does not assist in respect of whether the mark was a result of a stamping action.
That's correct, yes.
And this will be a matter for the chair to decide.
Yes.
But insofar as you're able, you've not been able to find anything supportive of that.
No, I haven't.
Thank you. Can I ask you, when you're talking about the transfer of material from the ground onto the vest, again, would the passage of time impact on that or the existence of that transfer?
In this particular instance, it's about the erosion of the material that's been transferred through the subsequent examinations. If that item had been recovered and stored in conditions where it wasn't impacted in terms of it wasn't abraded, it wasn't lost through various examinations or moving about in the bag and that sort of thing, then those deposits would have stayed there until the point of an examination. But it's because of the nature of the deposits being fragile and the movement and the friction that's impacted on it. So if it had been packaged in such a way that prevented that, you could come to it many, many years later and still carry out the examination you could have undertaken if you'd have done it at day one. And
where would one find such conditions? Would that be assistance of forensic experts, or?
It's all about the preservation and packaging of the item. If you package a footwear mark in the appropriate way, even a fragile one, it will be preserved and prevented from deteriorating. In this case, it would be very difficult to have preserved that mark on that item as it stood, because of the nature of it, with it being fabric and being placed in a bag. The ideal thing would have been if it was identified as a key mark at the absolute outset and the beginning. If for example, this was being undertaken at a murder inquiry, for example, and this was on a victim on the floor, to preserve that, what you would do in the ideal situation is cut that out and then take that away and preserve it individually if the significance of it had been identified at that point.
So if individuals had identified it as being of considerable significance at an early stage, that's the type of thing that could have been done?
It could have been done, yes.
Yeah. And that would have preserved the marks or any marks that were on the vest at the time?
It would, but it's a balance about the other examinations that need to be undertaken and the priority of them and the likely significance. So it's all about the original strategy that's set for the examination.
So if that strategy had been developed, perhaps by senior officers, that could have been done with the assistance of forensic experts, could it?
It could have been done, yes. it is one of those situations where I'm not sure that the significance of that would be recognised at that point. It is a difficult item to recover and set a strategy for.
So it would depend when it was recognised as being possibly significant.
Yes.
But if that had been drawn to the attention of forensic experts at any time, that could have been considered.
It could have been, yes.
Thank you. And that would have perhaps avoided some of the possible erosion of the material.
It could, but if the strategy that was set, it did record the image at an early stage before all the treatments were done. So that there was a strategy in place to try to record and maximise the detail that was there. That was then set, and then they went on to progress the examination to do the more destructive things, which, in my view, wasn't an unreasonable set of examinations to do.
And going back again to thinking about this transfer, perhaps on the front of the vest from the ground, with a forceful dynamic motion being applied to the rear, has the forensic tests having been carried out caused a potential impact to erosion?
I didn't see anything in the earlier photographs that were taken that would suggest there was anything there that could have been lost.
Thank you. And we've talked about a scenario if there was not that forceful dynamic motion, such as a stamp or more than one stamp. What if there was a less forceful dynamic motion, not a stamp, that caused the shoe to come into contact with the vest? Again, would you still expect a possible transfer of material from the ground in that situation?
Not necessarily. It all depends on the circumstances and the position. If they may well have been in direct contact with the ground, if they were in direct contact with the ground at the time, regardless of how much pressure was applied, then you probably expect a transfer to have occurred. But again, we've got the equipment in there that we've mentioned, which may prevent that contact from taking place.
And then looking at paragraph 35, please. You've set out your conclusions in this section, which the Chair can consider. At paragraph 35, you say, "It is my opinion that the marks in the form of deposits on the rear of the fluorescent police vest in the vicinity of the police badge are poorly defined, and it is not possible to offer a view from examination of the marks as to what may be the source of this mark."
Yes.
So does that open the possibility there could be many different possible sources of this mark?
In my view, yes.
36, I do not recognise any features within this mark that would allow me to offer an opinion that it had been made by the undersurface or sole of an item of footwear.
That's correct.
And that would be any item of footwear.
Yes.
37, I have found no correspondence with the footwear of Mr. Bio or PC Walker that would allow me to provide an opinion that either of these sets of footwear could have produced this mark.
That's correct, yes.
38, as a consequence of the poorly defined nature of the marks, I am also unable to exclude the possibility that either or both of these sets of footwear might have contributed in some way to the marks on the vest. So you can't exclude that possibility either.
That's correct, yes.
And then 39, overall it is my opinion that the marks considered in this instance are unsuitable to undertake any meaningful comparison, and hence do not provide any opportunity to offer an expert opinion that would assist in addressing whether or not the marks on the fluorescent police vest might have been made by the footwear provided to me.
That's my opinion, yes.
And so unfortunately you're not able to assist the Chair in terms of forensic examination in relation to these marks.
That's correct.
Thank you. I'd like to just confirm one other thing. We heard evidence previously in the earlier hearing from an Alison Marvin, and Alison Marvin gave evidence on the 17th of June this year. She was a forensic scientist with the SPA in
Yes.
chemistry. Now, we have a transcript of her evidence to this hearing. I will summarise, if I may, what she said, and I'd like to ask you if you agree with her conclusions. The partial mark on the high visibility vest was found to have insufficient detail for a meaningful comparison to be carried out. I think
I agree with that.
you
yes.
agree with that. Marks on the jacket possibly included a triangle. It's possible that this is one of the elements from the shoes of the deceased, but there is really insufficient detail or resolution of marks for any meaningful comparison.
That's correct, yes. I agree with that.
You agree? A meaningful comparison. So for one pattern element, just a triangle, it's not a unique shape. To say that the triangle was from a certain item, if you have only got one pattern element, that would be quite misleading if you haven't got any of the other pattern elements round it about.
That's correct. And because we're talking about what is potentially a triangle, it may not actually be a triangle that's deposited it. It could be a partial deposition of a four-sided block, which is deposited a triangular shape. So,
You mean like a square or a rectangle?
yes, it could be because it's a partial contact. It might not even be that, although you've got a triangular shape, that it's actually been deposited by a triangle.
Thank you. We've got a possible triangle, but there was nothing else of the pattern of the shoe soles round about it.
Yes.
You agree with that as
Yes.
well? And then, if there has been a full contact with the full sole against the item, depending on what the substance the item is made of is, it may be unusual to only get one pattern element and not have anything else show up. If somebody, for example, stood on this table and the table was dusted, she was referring to the table in front
Yes.
of her at the time, I wouldn't expect to only see one part. If the full sole has come into contact with the table, I wouldn't only expect to see one part of the mark or one pattern element there. I would maybe expect to see more. You might not have the full mark, but you would expect to see more than just one piece. Obviously, it depends on the shape. If there's a curvature of the item that's been touched, maybe only part of the item does come into contact with the sole of the shoe. But for full sole contact, you might expect to see more than one. But again, it might depend on what's on the sole of the shoe, or if there's been something on the vest that's reacted with something that the shoe has come into contact with. I appreciate that was a long passage. I can go through it more slowly if that would help you. Do you agree with what she said there?
The expectation is that if a shoe comes into contact with a particular surface, and it deposits a mark, you would expect to see a representation of more than one pattern element. You would expect contact from multiple ones that would be manifested in the mark. You might not get the shoe in its entirety, you might only get a few pattern elements, but you'd expect to see at least a few surrounding ones. There may be an extreme situation whereby the deposit that's been put down by the shoe has only been in contact with one pattern element. So when the shoe comes into contact, the only transfer that occurs is that contaminant from that one block. But we've got a lot of the mark there in terms of its extent, and there's one possible triangular shape in there, but that, in my view, doesn't correspond particularly well with any of the shoes.
Thank you. So, from what you're saying, it sounds like largely you do agree with what Alison Marvin said to the chair about these different issues.
My expectation would be there would be a mark of greater extent than a single pattern element, yes.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Could you give me a moment, please? Thank you. I have no further
Thank you.
questions.
Now, there were no Rule 9 written applications. Are there any oral applications? The Dean of Faculty. Mr. Ryder, I wonder if you would withdraw to the witness room while I hear a submission. Yes, Dean of Faculty.
My Lord, contrary to what your Lordship just said, we did submit a Rule 9 with regard to Mr. Ryder.
Oh, did you?
Yes.
Sorry, I didn't realise.
And as part of that, we would like to explore what the witness has just said with particular regard to the photographs and the triangular mark there, the photographs at Perk 01176. As was heralded in the latter parts of the Rule 9 application. I would imagine, my Lord, it'll be no more than 5 or 10 minutes.
And do we have these photographs in the system?
Indeed.
Very well, I'll allow you to ask these questions.
Obliged.
Can we have the witness back, please? Mr. Ryder, you're going to be asked some questions by the Dean of the Faculty of Advocates, who represents two of the attending officers.
Okay.
Dean.
Obliged, Lord. Mr. Ryder, just very briefly, please. We heard from Professor Dawson of Lockhard's principle, where every contact leaves a trace. You'll be familiar with that.
Yes.
I assume it works in reverse. If there's a trace mark on a garment, then that's the result of contact with something.
Yes.
Can we have the photographs again on screen, please? Perk 01176. And now I think I have these slightly differently, but can we find photograph Res 32, which is page, I think it was page 48 of my PDF, but Res, yes. We go, no, that's slightly different. We'll go back up a couple, please. I'm looking for the front of the jacket, please. Yeah, there we are. So that's the front of the jacket. It's pretty clean. Do you agree with me?
Yes.
Yeah. So it's not in general, it's not a dirty jacket.
No.
And if we go to Res 34, please. This is the close-up of the mark. Something has left this mark.
Yes.
And just looking at these marks, I should say, and in particular, if you look immediately below the intersection of the reflective strips, if you could point, please, to what we've been talking about as the triangle.
Sorry.
I'm sorry. Do we need to enable?
Okay. Oh, sorry, it's just... I should try again. Yeah.
Just to the right of that, the circle you just put on.
There. That's why I understand this to be the triangle that was being referred to.
Right. What about to the right of that? You see a triangular mark? I don't know if I can. Don't think I can do it. But
Are you referring to that there?
slightly to the left of that, there's a mark that seems to have three sides. You see that?
That one?
Yes, that one.
It's got three sides, but I wouldn't describe that as being a triangle which I could definitively relate to an item of footwear.
How else would you describe a shape with three sides?
Well, it's not regularly sided in terms of it. It's not got straight edges to the triangle. It's not sharply defined.
No, but we've heard already that these things can be blurred as a result of the way in which the foot comes into contact, yes?
Yes,
And that is a three-sided shape, is it not?
it is.
If you look upwards in the photograph and then to the right, there's, I think, 3 black lines, possibly a 4th if you look to the reflective strip as well. Can you identify those? Yeah. Certainly 3 black marks, and would you agree with me that looks like a geometric pattern of some sort?
There's three, four, possibly 4 lines that have got a consistent spacing to them, but in terms of the geometric element, I can't see what's caused those.
Well, something with a geometric pattern has had to have applied that mark. Do you not agree, given the regularity of the spacing between the lines?
Potentially, but it could also be a single contact and that is separated, and that is a result of creases in the fabric. We just don't know.
But there are 3, possibly 4 lines effectively in parallel with regular spacing.
Yes.
Yeah. And you'll recall the acetates of Mr. Bio's boots. We looked
Yes.
at them earlier. They contain, on the outer aspect, treads which contain parallel lines, don't they? If we go to SPA 00024. If you look at let's look at the left-hand side. There are parallel lines, are there not there?
Are you referring to the chevrons?
Yep. If you just look at the upward diagonal aspect of each chevron,
Yes.
parallel lines. Yep.
Yep.
And there are triangles.
There are.
Now, as you say in your own report, you say as a consequence of the poorly defined nature of the marks, I am unable to exclude the possibility that Mr. Bio's boots might have contributed in some way to the marks on the considered vest. So you can't exclude it, can you?
I can't exclude it, no.
But something left those marks on Nicole Short's vest.
It did.
Something that she encountered since the last time that vest was washed.
Yes.
Yes? And if she put that vest on clean that day, something that happened to her that day.
Yes.
And it could have been a shoe. You can't exclude that.
I can't exclude that. In terms of the pattern elements that you were referring to, though, as part of the examination that we undertook, we did consider whether those could be part of the shoe. The process I described for laying the overlay on the mark to try to find things, and the spacing of those elements, although there is 4 regular spaced elements, don't correspond with the pattern elements on the shoe.
But again, that would depend the way in which a boot interacted with that vest, because there could be scuffing and movement and the like.
Yes.
And when you say you undertook that analysis, given that you were unable to locate the triangle I'm talking about first, do we understand you were looking at a different triangle?
I was looking at the deposits in their entirety, looking for areas of correspondence that I could see, looking for elements that I could be satisfied could relate to an item of footwear, so that I could form a view, A, it had been formed by a shoe, and B, whether it could have been formed by either of these 2 pairs of shoes specifically. And from my examination, I didn't see any character in there that was sufficient to allow me to form that opinion.
But you do agree with me, we see a 3-sided shape mark on the vest.
I agree there's a 3-sided shape there, but from that particular 3-sided shape, I wouldn't attribute to an item of footwear because it's not specific, it's not sufficiently defined to be satisfied that it's a triangle because of the irregularities to it.
Which could be down to scuffing.
Potentially.
and we do see triangular shapes on the acetate of Mr. Byles' boots.
There are, but none of them correspond specifically with the triangles that have been explored within that mark.
This is really where I'm asking you to get to, Mr. Ryder. Something has happened to put that mark on PC Short's vest,
I agree, yes.
and you can't exclude the possibility it was that boot or its companion.
I can't exclude the possibility it's contributed to that mark in some way. If the entirety of that mark was a single contact with that boot or either of those boots, what I'm seeing isn't what I would expect to see.
But you can't exclude the possibility.
That it might have contributed to parts of that mark, yes.
Thank you. Obliging, Lord.
Thank you very much for coming to give evidence to the inquiry. I'm going to adjourn in a moment and then you'll be free to go.
Okay.
I'll adjourn now until 10 o'clock tomorrow morning. Very well, Mr. Ryder, contrary to what I just said, would you return to the witness room and you are free to go? Ms. Mitchell.
Obliged to the Chair for allowing this. It is understood from what my Lord has said this morning that an application is pending in respect of certain evidence that is going to be heard, which has already been pre-recorded. Clearly that's been pre-recorded for a long time, and the date which it was supposed to be heard has also been known for a long time. The application is still, as I understand it, not before the inquiry, and I would respectfully submit that the inquiry ensures that that is done promptly by setting a time limit for later today for that application to be in. That might allow the matter to be dealt with overnight or tomorrow morning, and for a decision to be made on that matter and evidence-led if necessary. The inquiry will, of course, understand that, as it's already expressed this morning, the evidence of this witness is of some import to the inquiry, and particularly the family of Mr. Sheikh Obayo. Given that the inquiry is not sitting this afternoon, it would no doubt provide ample time for such an application to be before the inquiry. Unless that's done, my Lord, it does mean that this matter would be carried over until the inquiry next sits, and that's not due to sit until starting the last day, I think, of January, and it really means that this matter would be carried over until February, and I would respectfully submit that it's a matter that could and should be dealt with before then.
Thank you, Ms. Mitchell. I've noted what you said. I shall adjourn.